Finally, let's talk about campaigns and elections. Campaigns and elections. First, let's talk about the purpose of elections. Why do we even have elections? Our first instinct is to say, so we can elect people. And that makes perfect sense. Uh, that's all democracies. But there are more underlying, deeper reasons why nations and governments want elections. First and foremost, elections provide legitimacy to government. Legitimacy basically means that the people respect the government's right to be there. They respect the laws that the government makes, and they are not committed. That's not the word I'm looking for. They are obligated to follow those laws. And the only way that this legitimacy of government can be achieved is through the electoral process. The only way people are going to follow laws of a government is if they choose the members of the government making the laws on their behalf. That's simple social contract that we talked about early in the semester. So democratic elections or authoritarian elections. Now we know that we have democratic elections for the most part. What that means is just about, with some exceptions, just about anybody can run for office that wants to run for office. And we're free to vote as citizens for whoever we want to vote for. That's a democratic election. Uh, the media must, in a democratic election, must run ads and allow any candidate to place their ads in that medium. Now, so that's your traditional democratic election. Now, there's also something called authoritarian elections. Uh, all over the country, there are dictators who have elections in their country every year, and of course, they always win with like 99% of the vote. Uh, those are not necessarily democratic elections. They're what we call authoritarian elections, where there usually is only one candidate. Nobody can run to challenge the existing dictator or the existing members of the government. There's uh, threatening oversight. There's intimidation to force people to vote in the correct way, and the media, which is usually state controlled by the government, will usually never run any advertisings that support the opponent, if there is an opponent, of the authoritarian leader. So that's the difference. Saddam Hussein used to have an election every 5 years in Iraq, and he would win that election with 99% of the vote. That's not a democratic election. That's an authoritarian election, because nobody is free to vote how they want. Nobody is free to run against Saddam Hussein, and the media, which is was controlled by Saddam, basically was required to only air positive ads for Saddam Hussein. Also, another purpose is that it may provide a mandate. An election may provide a mandate. If you get a majority of the vote in an election, then you basically have a mandate. And by definition, a mandate is a command indicated by an electorate's vote for the elected official or party to carry out their platform. And what it means is this: if I'm running for president and I'm campaigning for an entire year before the election, and everywhere I go, I say, okay, when I get elected, I am going to implement policy A, policy B, and policy C. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this when I'm elected, I'm going to do this when I'm elected, and I'm going to do this when I'm elected. A, B, and C. And I say this to everybody. And everybody who goes to the polling places to vote knows that that's what I've been saying. Therefore, if I get elected, I have the right I have a mandate to carry out policies A, B, and C. Because everybody knew that that's what it said I was going to do, and they voted for me. So that's a mandate. And the bigger the election margin by which you win, the greater your mandate is. If you just squeak by, winning 51% to 49%, well, you got 49% of the people that didn't want policy A, B, and C. But if you win with 65% of the vote, then you've got almost, two-thirds of the public that says, yes, I want policy A, B, and C. So the greater the electoral winning percentage, the greater the mandate. Now, there are different types of elections. Nomination election, process by which parties choose their candidates. Each political party in all national elections They each have their own process of picking the candidate that they will run against the other party's candidate. This is the nomination process. And there's two ways to do this. First is a caucus, where members of the party in different locations throughout the state and the country meet. Now, you have to be a member of the political party, and you have to take time out of your day to go to these meetings to select the candidates. Usually it's just party activists that go to the caucuses, not just your average Joe Schmo. Uh, the other type is a primary election, where members of your political party will go vote in a primary election, which come usually just 6 months, 8 months before the general election. The primary election, you can vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, and in that election, you choose the Democrat or the Republican, whichever one you vote in. You choose which candidate among those you want to run in the general election against the opposing party. There are two types of primary elections: open and closed. Closed primary elections, you can only vote in that party's primary election if you are a registered member of that party. In an open primary system, you may vote. You don't have to be registered with either party. You only have to be a registered voter, and you can vote in either one of the party primaries. But you can only vote in one. If you vote in the Republican primary, you can't, the same day or the next day go vote in the Democratic primary. Texas is an open primary state. If you are a registered voter, you can vote in either primary, but you can only vote in one of those in each election cycle. Then, once all the parties have determined and have nominated their candidates, then they will run in the general election. That's the national election where voters decide who will actually take the office. Remember, the primary elections and the caucuses are only determining which member of that party would actually run for the office under the party label. Now, once that has been determined, you have the general election where the Democrat that was chosen in the primaries and the Republican that was chosen in the primaries, they run against each other to determine who will actually become the member of Congress, the governor, the president. Other types of elections, the initiatives. Now, Texas does not have any of these. These are very progressive types of elections that many other states have, but not Texas. An initiative is an election where the citizens propose legislation or citizens propose the law, usually by a petition, and then it's submitted to the state electorate for a vote. So that an initiative completely bypasses the state legislature when passing laws, because the citizens propose it and the citizens vote on it. A referendum, the legislature actually submits the law or the legislation to the voters to decide on whether to pass it or not. So the state legislature would say, okay, we want to pass this law, but we don't want to do it ourselves. It's so important that we want the people to decide. So they submit it to the voters. And then a recall is to remove an incumbent from office before their term is up. Maybe they've committed a crime, or maybe they've done a very poor job, and we don't want another 2 or 3 years of that person in office. So you can have a recall election to force a new election to determine whether that sitting official, the governor or whatever, will stay in office or will be replaced. Here's a map that shows methods of selecting Democratic Party presidential delegates. These are purple are closed primaries that we talked about, where you must be a registered member of that political party to vote in their primaries. Open primaries are kind of that teal color, that greenish teal, where you just need to be a registered voter, and you can vote in either primary. Texas, of course, is an open primary state, and then the orange ones or the gold ones are those with that use the caucus system. Of course, the most famous caucus is the Iowa caucus, which is the first one of the first caucuses and first elections, primary elections, in each presidential election cycle. Okay, now let's talk about presidential elections a little bit. Presidential primaries and caucuses. Okay, every 4 years, we did it in 2012, We'll do it again in 2016, again in 2020. We have presidential elections. And we go through the very process that we just talked about in order to decide who will run for the office, and then we will then in the end choose the presidential candidate that will win the election and assume the office. So the primary process, and the primary caucus process, that is that process of both parties choosing which candidate they want to finally run for the office. The key and the goal in this process, the primary process, is to accumulate a majority of that party's delegates. Each state, usually based on their population and the number of party members that they have in each state, each have a certain number of delegates. And these delegates commit themselves based on primary elections or caucuses. These delegates commit themselves to vote for whichever Republican or whichever Democrat they are they are part of. If they're part of their primary or nomination process, they're committed to voting for those at the national convention. Now, the goal is to get a majority. Once you get a majority of your party's delegates, then you win that party's nomination. The key here to winning a party's nomination is early momentum. You have to win early. And the earliest primaries and caucuses are the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. And so any candidate for president that wants to win their party's nomination is going to spend a lot of money and a lot of time in New Hampshire and Iowa. Why is it so important to get that early momentum? Well, first of all, the news is all over these, or they're all over these primaries. They're covering them, so much in a 24-hour news cycle. They're covering almost all the time. And so you may have 7 or 8 candidates vying for the Democratic nomination or the Republican nomination. And so if you have 7 or 8 candidates, when the first few elections are over, the first few nomination elections, the primaries and caucuses are over, the media is going to be focusing on who? The winners. Who won, who came in second. They're going to get all the media coverage. Who's not going to get any media coverage? Who's not going to get any FaceTime on television? Those that came in 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. So news coverage. That's FaceTime on TV that is so valuable to winning elections, to get your name out there, name recognition, to show the people that you can win. And that ties in directly with fundraising, because there's a lot of people out there, a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans who are sitting there with money in their pockets, and every presidential election they donate money to a candidate. Well, if they're sitting there watching the first couple of caucuses and primaries, they're going to want to give their money to somebody that has a chance to win. And so they're probably going to wait till the first couple of primaries or caucuses and decide, well, who's a viable candidate? If you come in 7th or 8th, nobody's going to give you their money, because that would be wasting money in their mind, because you don't have a chance to win. But if you come in 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, well, you've got a shot. So you're more likely to be able to raise money. That's why winning early is so important. Also, because winning early is so important, these candidates spend tons of money in Iowa and New Hampshire. And now other states want some of that money, so many states are what we're calling front-loading their primaries, moving it sooner, earlier in the election cycle in order to get some of that advertising money, hotel, restaurant money that goes into Iowa and New Hampshire. Now, once the primaries and caucuses are complete, and each party determines who their candidate will be, they have the National Party Convention. They have it every 4 years, and the out-of-power party goes first, meaning in the presidential party. So President Obama is a Democrat. So in 2016, which is when the next National Party conventions will be held, the Republicans will go first because they're out of power in the presidency. Historically, oftentimes nobody knew who the candidate would be for each party until the National Party Convention, and they would actually choose the nominee at the convention. That could cause a lot of problems and could be very controversial. Now, today, Everybody knows who the candidate will be before they even get to the primary. You don't even try to um, determine it, because what happened was in 19, especially a good example is in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Of course, in 1968, you're in the middle of the Vietnam War, you're in the middle of the countercultural movement, the hippies, all that, but mainly the Vietnam War. That was a huge issue at the time in that presidential election. And the Democratic Party was split between pro-war Democrats and anti-war Democrats, and that split was manifested itself on the floor of the convention, where there were actual fistfights and, and conflict. And outside the convention center, in the streets, there were anti-war protests, and the police came in and uh, uh, were billy clubbing people, and it was all on national television. And they had not yet determined who the nominee would be. Would it be the pro-war nominee or the anti-war nominee to run as a Democratic candidate for president? Well, what happened was everybody at home, Joe Sixpack sitting at home, was looking at the Democrats going, "Oh my goodness, why would I want these people who are just brawling with each other to be running my country in the general election?" So in the general election, the Democrats got hammered. And it was a good lesson for both the Democrats and the Republicans. You better have your candidate chosen before the highly publicized, televised national conventions. So today it's just a unifying event. It's a pep rally, really, where all the former, after they've already chosen the person that would run, the former opponents in the primaries and in the nomination process will come back and support them, and promise to be a good soldier and support the candidates. Also, what will happen usually in the National Party Convention is that the presidential candidate will choose his or her vice presidential nominee. Now, once each party has completed the nomination process and decided who they want to be their candidate for president, then you have the actual presidential campaign. Uh, the candidate, there's certain aspects, there's certain traits that each of them have. Anybody that reaches this point in their political career must be highly motivated. And running for president is one of the most exhausting things that any person can do, because you're going state to state, town to town, every single day, giving speeches, shaking hands, raising money, having, kissing babies, all those things that presidential candidates do. And so and it is a nonstop uh, campaign for probably at least, um, a year, at least a year, usually longer. Uh, but one thing about it, you're not doing it by yourself. All candidates have an extensive staff of volunteers and professionals. The volunteers do things like going door to door, uh, you know, calling on phone banks to try to get people to vote. Then you have professionals, which these are generally people who are advisors, media advisors, campaign managers, pollsters, professionals that do specific jobs within the campaign to help the candidate get elected, to help the candidate hone their message, to help them, uh, make critical decisions and strategize in order to win the election. Uh, Now, the biggest part of a presidential campaign is the media. If you have paid any attention to any previous presidential elections, and I hope you pay attention to the future ones, um, media is necessary and expensive. You got to have it to reach the people. You got to have it to persuade people to vote for you, the candidate. There's two types of media. There's paid media and free media. Of course, paid media, obviously, by definition, is you pay for it. It costs money. But the reason it costs money is that you control the message. These are generally advertisements, commercials, uh, and you control the message. Therefore, you pay for the right to put it on television or on the radio or in a newspaper. There are different types of ads or messages that you can project, positive ads where you talk about how great you are as a candidate, and it's very positive. All the great things you're going to do, your history, your family, all those things. There's also negative ads, which are very popular, and because they tend to work, where you don't really talk too much about how the great things you will do as a candidate. You just bash the other guy. You talk about how terrible the opponent is and how they're going to destroy the country if they're elected. And usually it's all hyperbole and it's all overblown, but that's part of the campaign process, unfortunately. Then you have contrast ads, which basically you contrast, as a candidate, you would contrast your policy positions or your experience with the other guy's experience or the other woman's experience. And so, this is how I would do it. This is how they would do it. My way's better because of A, B, and C. That's a contrast ad. And then an inoculation ad is just an ad to kind of an inoculation is when you inoculate yourself from a disease, you get an immunization where you prevent worse things from happening by kind of taking your medicine early. And what happens is a lot of times when you run for president, the opponent will always be trying to dig up negative stuff about you, in your past or whatever. And so if you find out that they've dug up negative stuff, you want to get out there and talk about it first before they can run an ad or they can talk about it. So if maybe you had a hidden criminal record or something that nobody knew about, but they found out about it, your opponent did, and they were going to report it, well, you would come out first and say, I've been thinking about it, and I wanted to come clean on something that happened in my earlier years, and so I did this, and I've learned my lesson. I'll never do it again, and you can support me now. And so, we're a nation of second chances, so those things generally work. Now, free media, that's where you go on, you can go on television shows or, like you want to go on Jimmy Kimmel or the Tonight Show or those Sunday morning talk shows. If you go on those, it's free. It doesn't cost you anything to go on those shows. So you're getting free FaceTime with the American public. Millions and millions of people get to see you, get to hear you talk, get to hear you discuss your policies, and get to see you as kind of a human being. So that's the pros of it. That's great because you're getting exposure. But there's a negative side of that, and that is it's not scripted. You don't control everything. You don't really know what questions might be asked. And if you slip up, it's live usually, so you can't go back and fix it like you could if you were taping a commercial. So you have to be very, very careful in these free media environments because you can really make you can make bad mistakes. Now, another aspect of presidential campaigns is campaign finance. Elections are very expensive, advertising especially. 2008, I haven't quite updated it yet, but 2008, over $1 billion was spent. That's $1,000 million was spent amongst the two major candidates uh, in the election. Uh, in the past, there are individual contribution limits as far as what you can give directly to the candidates, but the Supreme Court has ruled in Citizen United case that interest groups and anybody else can spend as much money as they want, even if it's in the billions of dollars, just one person or one company, to run their own ads in favor of a candidate. So this greatly skewers the political landscape in favor of the wealthiest people. They're able to reach many, many more voters than just say the average person. Now, in the general presidential election, people within each state they go and vote. Okay, and when they go and vote, they are basically voting for their state's members of the Electoral College to go choose who the president will be. Now, the Electoral College is just a system of election. It's just a group of people who represent each state, and they actually choose the president. The founders' purpose of this was to create a buffer between the selection of the president and the masses. The founders did not trust the masses. The founders did not trust the average farmer, the average person, to be smart enough to choose a good president. So they wanted to make sure that if the people made a bad choice, that there was a mechanism to change that choice. And that mechanism is the Electoral College. Now, for the most part, whoever wins the election within each state, the Electoral College chooses that person. But they don't have to. Okay, they don't have to. They always have, but they don't have to. Now, the winner must get a majority of the Electoral College, and that majority would be 270 votes. So, and each state has a specific number of electoral votes that is equal to the number of House of Representative members and the number of Senate members combined. So each state, as we know, has 2 senators. And each state, even the smallest ones, have at minimum 1 House of Representatives member. So the minimum number of electoral votes that any state can have is 3. 2 senators, 1 House of Representatives member. Now, of course, since House of Representatives is the number of members of the House of Representatives for each state is based on the population of that state. The more populated the state is, the more House of Representative members they have, therefore the more Electoral College votes they have. So California has the most Electoral College votes. Texas has a lot. New York has a lot because they are the most populated states. Florida, the smaller states, Wyoming, Montana, Rhode Island, they have fewer electoral votes because they have fewer House of Representative members because they have smaller population. So the way it works is except for a few minor exceptions, it's a winner-take-all system. It means whoever wins the state of Texas between the candidates for president, that candidate gets all of the Electoral College votes for that state. So they could win by 1 vote, and they get all the votes in the Electoral College. So criticisms of this, it is possible to not win the popular vote and win the electoral vote. You can have more people in America vote for the loser, yet that person doesn't win because they didn't win the big states. They didn't win the larger states with the most Electoral College votes, because in the end, it doesn't matter how many American citizens voted for which presidential candidate. All that matters is which presidential candidate won which states. And we'll look at the Electoral College map here in a minute. Congressional elections. There's something called an incumbency advantage. The incumbent is the sitting congressperson who's running for re-election, and incumbents win 80 to 90% of the time. It's difficult for a challenger to win a congressional election. And this incumbency advantage includes staff support. You've got people working for you, paid for with tax dollars, to help you do your job well. Your media and travel is paid for, so you can go back and forth to your home district and without having to pay for it yourself. And campaign, you can redistricting, which is the changing of the congressional districts, can be the shape of the congressional district when it's changed in redistricting can be reshaped to benefit a sitting congressperson, and all of these things give you, especially the media and travel, give you name recognition. It reminds people of who you are, and any challenger is going to know this, that they have a 10 to 20% chance of winning and an 80 to 90% chance of losing. A challenger does, so that's going to scare most of them off, and that has a scare off effect. Countervailing forces that might cause an incumbent to lose, they can also be redistricted out of their seat. The district could be redrawn in such a way that they lose support. Scandal, marital infidelities, bribes, anything like that can cause a sitting congressman to lose their elections. Presidential coattails, if the the president, if the presidential winner in an election is of the opposing party of a sitting congressman, it's very possible that that sitting congressman will lose to the opponent that's of the same party as the president, and that means that that opponent has ridden the presidential coattails into office. And then midterm elections, usually uh, incumbents lose, especially the presidential party's incumbents lose uh, seats in the midterm elections. And the midterm elections are those elections that fall between the presidential elections. So you have a presidential election in 2012. We're going to have another one in 2016. This year, 2014, we're going to have midterm elections where we'll basically elect all the people that we normally elect, governors and members of Congress, only not the president. Okay, here's the 2012, the last most recent presidential election, the Electoral College breakdown. How many electoral votes each state has? Uh, California 55. They have the most. Texas second with 38, and then you have Florida and New York with 29. And those are the big boys. And then you have some of the smaller ones like Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. They have the minimum, 3. Alaska. So the goal is to win uh, enough states and accumulate enough electoral votes to get a majority of all of them. And so you focus your attention on the larger ones if you think you can win it. If you don't think you can win a large state, you don't waste your money. Democratic presidential candidates usually don't spend any money in Texas, or very little, because they know they can't win. Texas is a very conservative state, usually votes Republican. The opposite is true for California. Republicans generally don't, presidential candidates don't spend a lot of money and time in California because California is a very democratic state and they don't have a very good chance of winning it. So what they do is they focus their money and attention on what's called toss-up states. Uh, States like Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these bigger states that it's each election it can be go to a different party. It's very evenly split. And here's just an electoral map showing how the 2012 presidential election played out. As you can see, the South and the Middle America is red. Therefore, that those states, those electoral votes went to Republican candidate Mitt Romney in the 2012 election. The blue states concentrated in the West and the Northeast, and then what was known as the Rust Belt, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, those areas. Those states went to uh, President Obama, who was running for re-election, in Florida. Florida is really the pivotal state, but but anyway, it just shows how the nation is kind of broken up into Democrat and Republican sections, if you will.